Like as the waves make towards the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end, each changing place with that which goes before. In sequent toil, all forwards do contend. Nativity, once in the main of light, crawls to maturity, where with being crowned, crooked eclipses against his glory fight. And time, which gave, doth now his gift confound. Time doth transfix the flourish set on youth, and delves the parallels in beauty's brow, feeds on the rarities of nature's truth, and nothing stands but for his scythe to mow. And yet, in times to hope, my verse shall stand, praising thy worth, despite his cruel hand.
Our revels now are ended, and these our actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself, yea, all which it inherit, shall dissolve. And like this insubstantial pageant faded, leave not a rack behind. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep.
Good evening. You've tuned into Kirill Gerstein Invites, an online seminar hosted at Kronberg Academy. We're gathered virtually, but we are together in spirit. I hope you can all see me, and now you'll be able to see Simon Callow. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Simon to our seminar, and we'll be hearing him talk about Shakespeare in time, as he titled the conversation today. And there's much to talk about. And Simon is a great actor, director, an eloquent writer, also about music, a subject that he speaks about so intimately and in a very caressing way, I'd say. So all these things to talk about. So I won't take time with my introducing Simon, and I don't think it's needed. So welcome, Simon. It's great that you're here. I think even this beginning, the little Shakespeare excerpts that I found online are so mesmerizing. And as things that are so masterful, it's hard to penetrate them or to see behind the scenes, but I'm hoping that you can shed some light on what guides your interpretation of lines by Shakespeare, of poetic lines generally, what guides your thoughts and actions as an actor. And then I'm sure we'll talk about much else from Orson Welles and Richard Wagner. And of course, as always, the most important part of these live seminar events is that we have a live audience, and you're all invited to put your questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and I'll pass them on to Simon as we go in the flow of the conversation. So good evening, everybody, and welcome, Simon.
Thank you very much. Thank you for saying that. I wrote caressingly about music. That's very adorable. I do love it, music at a very deep level, even though I'm not a practicing musician at all. And everything that I understand about, I think, any kind of acting, it has its base in music of some sort. And this is something that is not widely believed or embraced in our time. I think people regard the music of verse and the music of a text by Shakespeare or by Pinter or whatever as suspect, and that they try to strip away the music. They think that's phony and false, but to me, in fact, it's the only way you can possibly understand it. And I've often had occasion when I have been teaching in America with young actors who are very often extremely nervous about Shakespeare. They really, really just feel daunted by it. And they want to do it tremendously, but they can't engage with it. And I always say to them, please, just sing it, sing it. And I've heard so many different versions, spontaneous versions of Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day by young American actors, wonderful inspirations. And they embrace, because I say, look, we're talking about language which has it's just like music. It's got bars, it's got meter, it's got modulations, it changes, it sometimes creates extremely complex rhythms and so on. And once you've listened for those rhythms, then you're a long way towards engaging with the inner life of the writing. The voice is such an extraordinary instrument, just such a thrilling resource, and yet people feel nervous about using it as if it were an instrument. They prefer to, they think that the meaning is everything. Well, it is, but the meaning can only be realized through the physical form that it takes. And those two extracts, those rather luscious things, the sonnet and that extraordinary speech of Prospero's, which is, I mean, it's very hard for me, I think, for almost any actor. I've never actually played Prospero, but any actor who plays the part, that's the end of that speech about our life being rounded with a little sleep is of such musical perfection. But and you see, I'm getting rather moved now, that I actually sometimes, when I've spoken that speech, which I have done many, many, many times, have found it quite hard to control the emotion. And that's true generally in Shakespeare. The music is so perfect. Even those people who don't greatly admire Shakespeare, as for example, George Bernard Shaw, the Irish dramatist, thought that Shakespeare's mind was the most commonplace mind that had ever been allowed to write a play. But he said, however, I have to admit the music. You know, the music is of absolute peerless perfection. So that's only me linking up to what you said about me and music. But may I just explain a little bit why I've called this thing Shakespeare in time?
Please.
It's obviously partly to do with meter and so on, but what I'm really thinking about is my own experience of the various lockdowns has been of an extraordinary timelessness, a curious sense of suspension. And I'm someone who's completely governed by time. There are more clocks in my house than there are in a jeweler's shop. I just adore clocks. And as a child, I used to dream of having, I had a dream that my classmates and I went swimming, but I didn't swim. I just took all their watches and kept them for them and put them all the way up my arms, you know, and this was my dream of, it was paradise to me to have all these watches. And when I woke up and I didn't have them all, I was a bit heartbroken. But so I'm governed a bit by time. I hope not in a neurotic way, but I really want to find the tempo of the day and the rhythm of what I'm doing and so on. And this has been suspended for me during lockdown. I remembered right at the beginning of it, a wonderful stanza from Coleridge's great poem, The Ancient Mariner, where he says, day after day, day after day. Hold on, what did he say? I've forgotten it. I'm sorry. Day after day after day, nor breath. You know, this is after the mariner has shot the albatross, and they find themselves in becalmed waters. He says, day after day, nor breath nor motion, idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. And that image just struck me so forcefully, this sense of stasis, of no movement at all. And again, to get slightly autobiographical, I've just moved house, and that's exactly the same thing. There's no rhythm, there's no shape to your day or to your thoughts or to your mind, I feel absolutely abandoned. And now, having also just had an operation on my foot, the same thing in a hospital. You're in the hands of other people's time. You just do what they tell you to do. You have no connection to time itself. So in the light of that, I just, if I may, I'd like to read a speech from Richard II, which is one of, most remarkably musical play. And when Richard II is put into prison, he hears some music. He says, "Music do I hear? Ha, ha, keep time. How sour sweet music is when time is broke and no proportion kept. So is it in the music of men's lives. And here have I the daintiness of ear to check time broke in a disordered string. But for the concord of my state and time, had not an ear to hear my true time broke. I wasted time, and now time doth waste me. For now hath time made me his numbering clock. My thoughts are minutes, and with sighs they jar their watches on unto mine eyes, the outward watch, whereto my finger, like a dial's point, is pointing still in cleansing them from tears. Now, sir, the sound that tells what hour it is are clamorous groans, which strike upon my heart, which is the bell. So sighs and tears and groans show minutes, times, and hours. But my time runs posting on in Bolingbroke's proud joy, while I stand fooling here, like Jack of the clock. This music mads me, let it sound no more, for though it have helped madmen to their wits, to me it seems to make wise men mad. Yet blessing on this heart that gives it to me, but 'tis a sign of love. And love to Richard is a strange brooch in this all-hating world. Well, I mean, it's fantastic, isn't it? I mean,
it's again mesmerizing, especially hearing you read it.
That concept of well, obviously the famous line, "I have wasted time, and now time wastes me." But there's something in that sense of music being an ideal in our life. Music makes sense, at least for Richard. I mean, it may be that later generations, but not even that. I mean, even you find it in Renaissance music, where they disrupt the whole thing. It's a sort of carnival thing where time is undone. But it seems to me as well, to go back to the lockdown, which is really the start of all my thinking here, is that there are many different senses in which time is central to our lives. If you play in a concert hall, or if you play in a theatre, or indeed if you're a dancer, you create time. And the hope is, in my view, that everybody in the hall or the theatre or the opera house goes into time, into the same time pattern, the same structure of time, so that we're all, so to speak, on the same page at the same moment. That collective event. Now, you could perfectly well argue that everybody in the hall, for what any of those artistic events, has a completely different view of what's going on. Some people will say this music is very melancholy. Other people will say it's, oh, I found it funny, or whatever. Some people will find Richard II narcissistic and lacking in any sense of proportion about his own life, or they'll say, yes, this is very true. But the point that we, I think all of us as performers, strive for, and it's a famous misunderstanding, certainly in actors, that what we really love is applause. We don't. What we love is silence. And I mean, of course, it's lovely when people laugh. Of course it is. And of course, applause is nice. But really, what we want is that, and you know immediately, almost immediately, when you have effected that connection, which is, I would say, inevitably a rhythmical connection, and you've just focused them down so as you could almost literally hear time past and time to come leave the room, and there's only time present. It's very, you said it the other day, T.S. Eliot kind of an idea. It's a Zen idea as well, but that is the moment when, for me anyway, and I'm getting over emotional about this because it's so long since I've been able to do that in front of an audience, you know. It's astonishing when that happens, how as human beings we cohere suddenly, and there is the people, the citizens, are suddenly brought together, and they're thinking the same thing at the same time. And part of this is because I think that, again, there must be some bridge between this and music, and you can tell me perhaps, but I've always defined acting in a very, very simple way, which is thinking the thoughts of another human being. Once you do that, once you're really autonomously thinking the thoughts of another human being, once you've got under the skin of the character and into the words and the mind of the character, then something utterly extraordinary happens, which is beyond all of us. And, you know, many people will disagree with this. Many people will think it's a romantic and a sentimental idea. But all I can say is that I've had the good fortune many times in my life as an actor of actually witnessing that, of in a way, I suppose you could say, channeling that. And we all know, musicians, I mean, God, I mean, I've been, I mean, there are moments, and it is like time stopping. I remember the other day, this is in the 60s, and I was but a boy, you know, but I was already hooked on music, classical music, as it's so stupidly called. But anyway, that music. And it was at the festival hall. It was an extraordinary concert. Yehudi Menuhin played the Berg Concerto quite late in his career, when he was not as technically strong, perhaps, as he had been, but his identification with it, and it was as if he had composed it. And Boulez was just, Boulez was conducting. It was absolutely there with him, and they created this. The audience was astounded, and this is in the 60s, not everybody, in fact, a very small percentage of the audience could bear the idea of listening to a piece of music by Alban Berg. In fact, I heard, believe this if you will, Claudio Abbado conducting the orchestral pieces and being booed at the end of it. I mean, that's in 1965. That's incredible. But it's what then happened was the second part of the concert was Mahler's Fifth Symphony, which was not yet as frequently played as it is now. And Boulez, of course, had that extraordinary linearity of thinking, which resulted in a finale, that great rondo finale, which just seemed to generate itself and just almost flew off the edge of the earth. And I had a religious experience at that moment. I'm not religious, but I had a religious experience. I just wanted, like the apostles, when Jesus says, comes back after the resurrection, he comes back, and the apostles, led by Peter, just say, please don't go away. Let us just stay here forever in this moment. And Jesus says, no, you have to get on with your work. What is important work? But I had that moment with the Boulez, that was just, and it was suspension of time. Time had run its course in the music, and now there was nothing left. It was extraordinary.
Yes, these are such powerful moments, and it's interesting that you say that the audience is brought together into this concentrated mode through time. It's certainly something that I'm also familiar with, and I think as musicians, of course, we strive for the silence, the attentive silence, which is rather different than the silence of them being asleep, but the silence of true concentration. But I haven't thought about it, that it's true that it's perhaps time, and in a sense, time being the most important element. Less so is the beauty of sound, for example, or all sorts of other commonly discussed attributes. But so many questions come to mind. You said acting is thinking another person's thoughts, and obviously another person's thoughts, or a person's thoughts, make you emotional, make you have and experience certain feelings. And this
Yes.
interests me with, be it musicians, actors, other performing artists. When you're acting, do you feel that for the audience to experience the emotion that you want to convey, you have to be experiencing it, and experiencing it to a high degree? Or do you feel that it is rather for the audience to experience it, and you're doing some other behind the scenes kind of manipulations in your mind? And it seems that from musicians, there are more or less two schools. There are people like Paderewski that in a very romantic way said, I have to burn 1,000 degrees hotter than the audience for them to feel some temperature. And then you have people, fascinatingly, Glinka, who was known to be a great singer also, said that, in fact, I record what provokes the emotions in the audience, and then I reproduce that, but I don't have to be feeling it. So as an actor and as a teacher, where do you stand on this, and what do you feel?
It's the great question, isn't it? It was the question that Diderot wanted to know in his great book about the art of the actor. How important is it? Are we, as it were, dealing with the nervous system, or are we dealing with our emotional lives? And the great English actor, David Garrick, 18th century English actor, Diderot was fascinated by him because he made a point at parties of showing a repertory of emotions like one after another, bang, 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 jealousy, rage, happiness, idiocy, blah, 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 like this, and would just do it instantly, and people went, God. And so Diderot drew a big conclusion from that and said, actually, everything has its source in the mind. This is just, he's mastered his own body, and he can show us. But people were dumbstruck by it because it was so. So when it was rage, they kind of leapt back because it was so ugly and terrible. And I think that it's a very curious mindset that you have to develop as a performer, certainly as an actor, in that you're riding a horse. You're letting it go, but you've got to make sure that the horse is the right horse, that the horse, and you have to have a great connection with the horse. But the horse is called Hamlet, you know, and you've got to sort of move Hamlet in this direction and that direction, but always by the way you handle what he has to say, but of course, or equally, you can. It's not exclusively through words that these extraordinary phenomena are released. There have been many actors who are famous for having very few words to speak, but somehow creating an atmosphere or a presence, which is, and I think that may be true of certain performers as well. But we've seen, you know, pianists create a mystique around themselves, which is an induction for the audience. Now, I, being, of course, horribly old-fashioned and having seen in my youth some truly extraordinary great actors who probably wouldn't be liked at all today, probably not regarded highly, because what they brought above all was it's terrible, we're forced to speak in rather clumsy language about this, a certain magic, a certain intensity, a certain atmosphere that this actor could bring on stage. And all the most famous, now, of course, long dead actors like Olivier and Gielgud and Guinness and Peggy Ashcroft, they all had this ability, which is actually beyond what I was talking about in terms of the character. It's just them, that they are extraordinary, or they create a sense of being extraordinary in themselves. Whether that meant that they necessarily gave the best interpretation of a role, I mean, Laurence Olivier was particularly controversial because he very much liked to root things in very down-to-earth terms, simple terms. So when he played Othello, he could think of no other way to do it except by absolutely making himself look like and behave like a black man, which even in the early 60s disturbed quite a lot of people. But other actors, Ralph Richardson, probably not perhaps so well known to all of our listeners, viewers, he was like a magus. He had a quality of inspiration about him. He was very eccentric. But the point was that you did, you really had an experience when you saw Ralph Richardson. I remember in the great Ibsen, late Ibsen play called John Gabriel Borkman. Borkman in the last act goes up and looks down, goes up into the mountains. He's a capitalist, you know, he's a ship owner and all the rest of it. And he looks down at the world of which he has been a part and knows that he's actually wasted his life. And up there on that mountain, he dies. And Sir Ralph was a very eccentric man, but Sir Ralph suddenly went, ooh, 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 ooh. And then he carried on. And I thought, this is so weird. I went home, I looked up the play, nothing. Ibsen didn't say anything about it at all. quite shortly afterwards, I went to work with Peter Hall, who directed it. And I said to Peter, whose idea was that? And he said, oh, Ralph's. So I said, well, did any of you say anything at the time when he, in rehearsal, suddenly did it? And he said, oh, no, we knew it was right. We wouldn't dream of saying anything about it. Well, that's a kind of level, that's a level of creativity in acting, which is given to very, very, very few. It was so convincing. Nobody laughed. You would have thought everybody would laugh. Not at all. Everybody just knew in the audience that they had seen a soul leaving the body. Amazing, incredible. And where that leaves the question of the relationship to the text and all of that, it is a conduit, of course, eventually. Somewhere along the line, there's this meeting point between the performer, the work, and the audience. There's a point of connection. And I absolutely can't play certain parts. I would love to play them. They're wonderful, great parts. And really, if I'd been, a proper actor, I would have played them, but I just couldn't, I wouldn't know how to begin. I love to see other people play them, but I can't. Macbeth, I couldn't possibly play Macbeth. I just couldn't even dream of it. No, I just don't know where I would go with that at all. So the point is that there's got to be some basic sympathy of me with the character and with the text, something that just stirs something really quite profound in me. And then I have to exercise all my skill and all my ability, my vocal capacities, my physical capacities, my sense of character, my ability to transform, which for me is the most important quality that an actor has. But interestingly, if I can introduce another element here, when I was at drama school, I was reading Alfred Brendel's first book, Afterthoughts on Music or something, I think it's called. And I was riveted by him saying that the job of the pianist, the musician, is to get inside the mind and the character of the composer. Of course, it's much more simple in music because you're not playing a character, you're playing a sonata. And I, in my case, of course, was playing a character. So what Brendel said to me here was, it's not just that you're playing Hamlet, Titus Andronicus, or Archie Rice in The Entertainer. No, you're also somehow evoking the spirit of the person who wrote this play. It must be, I direct plays as well, and as a director, I always regard myself, I hope it doesn't sound too vainglorious, as the writer's representative on earth, especially if he's dead. I mean, if he's alive also, but he or she is dead, then I really have to fight their corner. And it's not a question of saying, oh, well, in Moliere's time, they would have used fans. That's not what I'm talking about at all. It's the spirit of the creator is the thing that you're trying to connect to all the time.
Even though here to throw out one more element into this ever-expanding web of our conversation, don't you think, I find often that it feels like the piece, and even in speaking to composers, and certainly dead composers, not speaking to them, but don't you find that the piece eventually becomes its own living entity, and it becomes in some way quite independent of its creator? So if Beethoven had this or that biographical or psychological experience at the time, which we can't really know anyway. But the piece has its own universe and own life and own things own calamities that happen to a Moonlight Sonata or an Appassionata in the 200 years of being played. And so sometimes I actually find it helpful to abstract from the so-called the mind of the creator, or at least the human trappings of the creator, and concentrate on sort of what are the guiding principles in this little universe of a Schumann sonata.
Yes, I completely see that. I absolutely see that. And maybe it's just me. It helps me enormously.
Yeah,
but it's
certainly,
not.
Certainly, it all helps, and certainly one should also with the composers.
But I hope it's not just. I'm not just being literal about this. I want to. Very often when people do plays, they try to home in on what is everybody's experience, so as you get the universal play, the play that speaks to all of us. But I'm much, much more interested in the aspect of the play that is puzzling, that is odd, that doesn't seem to be part of all the rest of it. And that's when I ask myself, what did the writer think when he went on this strange journey, this little odd route? And Beethoven, of course, is full of that. You think, what? I mean, why this? And then it, of course, especially the late music, and then it does kind of pull itself together, but it's a hard thing to unify all that. But it works for me. That's all I can say. That's really all I can say.
Oh, it certainly does. And when we talk about performing, and you're performing in front of the audience, and this is another paradoxical question that we all face constantly. So it's a cliche to ask, but nevertheless, it's not a useless cliche to ask, I find. How much are you thinking of the hypothetical audience member? And this is already a problem to call audience, because this is not a homogeneous body and shouldn't be treated as such. But how much do you think of playing for the audience? How much is it for yourself? How much is it in that abstract space that you create and you feel the audience is welcome to come as close to it as they manage? So how much of a public act is this for you in an overt way?
Totally. For me, totally. Totally a public phenomenon. But I think what we're trying to do, I think it is a form of, I do seriously think that theatres and concert halls should be available on the National Health Service. I think it is it's a cure in a sense. But what I've always felt was that, because I saw this happen when I was very young, before I became an actor, I was at the university in Belfast, and a great old Irish actor came to do a one-man show that he did called The Importance of Being Oscar, about Oscar Wilde. And he was extraordinary. He was a very extraordinary creature. Even in Dublin, where he lived, he was outrageously camp. He wore a toupee, a wig, all the time. He wore makeup, stage makeup in the street. He was fundamentally exotic, utterly extraordinary. His conversation was jewels of wit and so on. It was an extraordinary experience at my age of 18 or something, 19, in Belfast, to meet this utterly exotic person. Of course, every night after I did whatever I needed to do for him backstage, I would go and watch the show. The thing that completely astonished me was so crystal clear in what he did was he didn't go out there to make the audience laugh. He went out there to make the audience witty. And they were doing all the work. And he gave them permission or something to start to see themselves as witty and clever. And they saw laughs that he hadn't worked for at all. But because they were now, their minds were really functioning in a different way. And I always thought this was just a wonderfully generous thing in one way to do, and a wonderful skill to have, a very therapeutic skill. And in that sense, maybe what we do on the stage or in the concert hall is, is this the right word? To educate the audience in some sort of way to their own possibilities. And another of my many phrases that I draw out of a brand tub on occasions like this to say is that I think that the theatre is the gymnasium of the imagination. That's where you work out your imagination. You go into training, it's suddenly, and that's why, of course, so often the theatre is at its utterly most wonderful when it's at its simplest, and people endow it. They see what is not there, which is also very fascinating. It's to do with this. I think you were asking this question a little earlier. It's not just this active-passive relationship. It's not us doing and them receiving. It's us titillating them, making them perhaps listen to things that they've never heard before, but again, without making it self-conscious, but just saying, oh my God, I'm hearing, and that again puts them into time present.
Yeah,
and us into time present too.
Yeah, Bruno Ganz told me that he felt that it was a bit of a slider. That he said that there were moments in things that he read that were quite private and more for himself, and then there was sort of a slider towards something being very publicly outspoken and very directed towards the public. And I felt observing him that there was the slider was in action, which I find is also sometimes useful to think in music playing.
Yeah, very good. It's very, very interesting that. And I remember a thousand years ago, I did a one-man show about Rousseau, directed by the writer, a brilliant man called Jean Jourdeuil. And he said to me one point, just one little note, he said, you must be alone with Rousseau in front of the public, not with the public and Rousseau at your side. You and Rousseau, me playing Rousseau, we had to have a relationship there, which the audience could be drawn into. And it really worked, and it changed my idea of acting. It was earlier on in my career, 1980 or something like that, 1981. And it was ecstatic, the relationship finally that I got with the audience on that thing. It was almost inaudible to begin with, and then they were drawn into the circle of fire. It was very.
To keep asking more questions about your processes of working, and there's a question from Guillermo Martinez, one of our participants. How is an actor able to memorize and perform with precision such ample characters like Hamlet or Henry IV? And could there be a parallelism with us learning entire works by memory? And I remember in our conversation a few days ago, you actually said about memorizing that you forget everything else. So, which I found wonderful as an illusion of what recedes and what is then brought to the forefront. Can you talk about memory as actually another manifestation of time and our dealing with time?
Yes, indeed. And I do, as I I've said too often already, I do a lot of one-man shows. I've done many, many, many. Well, it's a form that interests me greatly. But I mean, 15 or 17 one-man shows. And of course, that involves a huge feat of memory, because when I did a show called Being Shakespeare,
it's like the famous Liszt saying, "The evening is I."
Yes, exactly. Yes. but the thing is that I had to. I realized that I was learning more lines than there are in the parts of Hamlet, King Lear, and Othello rolled into one. You know. So, but the point is here that these words are so memorable, so utterly memorable. There are some writers who are fine writers, but who are much less memorable. And I'm stubbornly of the belief that Shakespeare was an actor, and I think that he wrote with an understanding of how actors will remember. And it's not hard. It's not hard to remember Shakespeare. It really isn't. But actually, in my life as an actor, when I was young, I had fantastic facility, and I would just learn things overnight. Many actors can do that. It's not such a surprising thing, and probably I know many singers and instrumentalists can do the same thing. Even conductors, you can master things very, 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 very quickly. But a point then came, I think probably in my 40s, when I found I couldn't really do that anymore. And I had to completely reinvent the art of memory for myself. And it's very simple. It consists of just asking what comes next and why. And so whatever, what is this? This next thing that I've got to do, how does it relate to the thing that came before? Why is this the inevitable thing I have to say after this? And it was very good, that, because it made me think much, much harder about it. And there are certain actors who are gifted with photographic memories, and I think there are musicians who are the same. I feel that they've lost out on something, because they haven't had to think, why? How does one thing lead to another? Because they just know it does. That's the next thing you say, because you've learned it. But to really think, and I therefore need, as an actor now, a longer rehearsal period than I did. And sometimes I don't get it. And then sometimes I get very frustrated. And I'm very frustrated generally as an actor, because play, either a one-man play or a one with other actors, I have to get a lot of bad acting out of my system before I can reach the good acting. It's partly facility. I can do things very easily. I can take on a character blah, 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 like this, but it means very little. And people have to put up with that from me in rehearsals. And thank God nobody's actually sacked me yet. But honestly, I would sack me if you saw some of the acting that I've done in rehearsal. And then, generally speaking, it resolves itself, and I find the sensation of the character, which is the great thing. Any actor will have heard the saying, if you can just say one line in character, there's no problem anymore. Just one line is totally as the man you're playing, you'll be all right. You just have to feed it back through all the rest of the part. Just that sensation will be enough. And I don't know, maybe it might be so with music. Do you sometimes find that you turn a phrase and you think, that's it, that's the way this works? I don't know. Does it happen for you?
Yes, I think so. And I think there are these I find that at least there are spots in the piece that while you're still trying to make yourself home in it, there's some spot or some corner that sort of speaks easier
Yes.
to you. And
Yeah.
that's where you start pulling the thread and say, well, okay, if that
Yeah.
feels like that, then maybe this will relate like this. And
Yeah.
and very often it's not the beginning. And very often
Yeah.
the beginning is what you end up searching for the most somehow. I find, at least for myself.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But so now we're at this point that I can ask you, how do you start working on these grand roles, or how did you? I mean, you've covered a lot of the grand roles, but how does one start with something? How do you start with something like Hamlet, or one of the iconic roles? Where would you begin?
I think you have to, first of all, get everybody else's Hamlet out of your mind. Secondly, you have to spend time with Hamlet. You have to just go over and over and over and over this thing. What is he up to? What is Hamlet up to? What's bugging him? Because it's really hard to see Hamlet anymore, to see him for what he is.
Yes, it's like the Mendelssohn octet. It's buried under thousands of festival performances. So I think we don't hear the piece anymore. We hear the 999 layers of sediment.
Yeah, exactly.
But how do you? Sorry, I keep drilling down. So how do you get everybody's Hamlet out of your mind? How would you suggest somebody gets out of their mind everybody's Moonlight Sonata?
Yes, it's a challenge, isn't it? For me, it's simply really unrelenting work on the text in the sense of saying, what is happening here? What is going on? There's a wonderful book from the 1930s, a scholarly book called What Happens in Hamlet. And the book is 350 pages long. And he forces you to think about every single phrase that Hamlet utters. What is he doing here? Why is he saying this? What kind of a person says this? What's the relationship with all these other people? It's quite pedantic. But then once you've done all of that for a long time, then you have to go off on your own, away from the book, and just try to get the taste of it in your mouth. Who is this guy? And there are, I was trained in the Stanislavski Method, so quite rigorously, and we used very, very much, to use exercises which are not really part of the main body of Stanislavski's work, but things that he suggested, like, you go out in character and buy some tobacco, but you have to do it as Hamlet. How do you do that? How do you speak to a shopkeeper as Hamlet? And you begin to get a sense of what it is like to be Hamlet at every minute of his life. And it's very, very, very important that 99% of Hamlet's life is off stage. He's on stage for 2.5 or 3 hours, but there's a massive underbelly to that life that we don't see at all on stage, but it's got to be there, implied, sensed, and even if at the simplest, most crude level, when you go off the stage, where are you going? What are you going to do? What happens when you're not on stage for all those, Hamlet has a long rest in the middle of the play. What's he doing? What's Hamlet? Well, we know. Eventually, we find out what he's been doing. But there's a sense of a continuous life within you. And very often, the things that you may, in your communings with yourself, you may start embellishing and start making things up that really aren't anything to do with Hamlet. And then you have to get a check on yourself and say, no. Who is he? What's he about? What's he up to? What are the obstacles in his life? What's preventing him from being what he wants to be? And so on, and so on. So, however, to go back to your question about how do you get rid of all the Hamlets, I've seen an awful lot of Hamlets. To be honest, I don't think many of them were their actors' best performances. But I was lucky enough very often to see Sir John Gielgud, whom I knew personally, often at gala performances, he'd do a speech of Hamlet. And then you saw something which was essential in Hamlet. You couldn't impersonate John Gielgud, you wouldn't want to, but something of the speed of thought, you just steal it, steal it immediately. It's a big detective work, tracking down your character. You have to come at them from every angle. You have to sort of outwit them. They don't necessarily want to give out their secrets. You want to, you've got to ambush the character in some sorts of ways, especially, I mean, it's so much easier with a new part in a new play, because, that's all you've got, what's on the page and what the author can tell you. But with Hamlet, there are so many possibilities. Not that I think, I don't really want to see Hamlet much anymore, although I'll certainly go and see Ian McKellen. Ian McKellen's doing it in London at the age of 82. He's playing Hamlet at the age of 82. So that I will most certainly go to see, because I saw him play it when he was 32. And so that'll be a fascinating journey. But one thing that has often struck me when I see Hamlet nowadays, I think I'm very uninvolved, very unmoved by it. And I think if some of those legendary gentlemen from Mars were to arrive and come to see this play in this production, and you said, oh, this is the most famous play ever written, they'd say, why? Because there's nothing that the actors or the production are doing with the play that would make you feel that it had that sort of breadth and greatness about it. That's an old-fashioned thought of mine.
I feel that often with classical music concerts also, it really does take also a good performance, because sometimes if you hear an average performance of, say, a Beethoven sonata or a Beethoven symphony, then if I think that I would take not even an alien, but somebody that's a cultured, interested listener, but not a classical music lover, could I responsibly say that this is what it's about? This is why this art form is great. And very often, I'm worried for the potential reply. And of course, these things, if you can read them, are just fabulous on the page. So I'm sure Hamlet is very rich to you as an experience on the page, without necessarily seeing it spelled out as a production.
Well, of course, that's what many of the Victorians felt about Shakespeare, that he was much better read in the study. But I contest that fiercely.
Yeah, no, I meant only as a sort of from the view of you as a professional. But of course, these things are meant to be played and seen and spoken. And speaking about spoken, so musicians are, as you know, very busy with this. With so-called stylistic considerations, whatever one calls that, and we could, very much dispute that from the outset. But there is the wonderful historical performance movement that has certainly brought into life a really fresh aesthetic. Who knows how historical it is, but it's very informed indeed, and it's a very different sound than we were experiencing in mid-20th century, for example. But the considerations for you, let's say, Elizabethan theater, not just to keep saying the name of Shakespeare, but pronunciation has changed, the language has changed, so much has changed. And so how much do you feel that you need to be informed about it, and how much do you think needs to inform your reading, if we even concentrate on just the meter, the timing, and the pronunciation of things?
Well, the pronunciation of things is that's a real problem, because already for the general public, Shakespeare contains an awful lot of vocabulary which people simply don't understand. You know, they literally don't understand it, and increasingly so. They just don't know what's being said anymore, and so that really is a pretty serious problem. If we had, you know, there's a lot of work, has been for centuries now, a work on what the Elizabethan theatre was actually like. And as far as we can make out from instruction manuals, for the most part, most actors had a set of gestures which they learned and which they brought out for the appropriate emotion. It was an absolutely ritualized thing.
Like a codified kind of, well, what Baroque music in the sort of the rhetorical codified gestures. No?
Or like kabuki theatre, or no theatre, even more. These are, and they've obviously somehow filled them. However, you were, you know, come to what Hamlet says, speak the speech trippingly to you as I pronounced it on the tongue, speak the speech on the tongue trippingly, or whatever it is, as I pronounced it to you. He's saying the exact opposite of that. He's saying, so many actors speak the lines as if they were the town crier. You know, I'd be happier to see the town crier speak my lines than that. So we think, the truth of the matter is that everything was moving at incredible speed in the Elizabethan theatre. And the whole idea of personation, of creating characters that were not stereotypes, that were not archetypes even, but were actually very complex human beings. This happened in a space of about 15 years. It suddenly happened, and Shakespeare was the supreme master of this, of creating life as we recognize it on the stage. And there are things in Shakespeare which just still knock one completely sideways, where it's just, he's transcribing real life, and it's quite clear in, for example, The Winter's Tale. The Queen Hermione is playing with her son Mamilius and teasing him, and she says, "Come and let's have a story. You're powerful at stories." And he says, "Sad or a happy story shall it be?" And she says, "Oh, a happy one." And he says, "I'll tell a story about witches." And she says, "Well, come and sit down. Come on, sit. Come on, sit." Well, this could be a soap opera. I mean, it's just so utterly ordinary and natural and miraculously true to a mother with her slightly show-offy son, and whom she adores, but who she doesn't want to encourage. And this kind of psychological thing started, you know, when Shakespeare started writing plays, as far as we know, Henry VI, Part 1, plays like that. It's all bombast and a very stentorian stuff, and not of no psychological insight. But as he goes on, and sometimes, as with early Mozart, where he's doing something completely conventional, and then suddenly for 10 bars, something miraculous happens, and he leaps forward about 5 years or 10 years in his own life and then goes back to doing perfectly ordinary stuff. The same thing happens in Shakespeare's early plays. You suddenly, something utterly devastatingly human and natural comes, as if that was what he was striving towards, and what the actors, no doubt, also now, the whole sense of what a man was, what a human being was developing so rapidly, which is part of what gives them their extraordinary sense of life and energy and actuality, because he's making it up. He's making up his understanding of, well, or the understanding that was in the air about the way people really are. He was beginning to write that down, and when Leontes in The Winter's Tale has his jealousy fit, it's just shocking, because it's so completely real, incoherent, mad, terrible, but not like the tyrants in the old plays. This is just, when your husband just goes mad. What the hell do you do when your husband loses it completely? I mean, but as I say, this is how he was right at the epicenter of it all, in the development of the language, in the development of the theatre, because of course they started using indoor theatres, which immediately changed everything in terms of the intimacy with which the actors could play. They were, they were standing on in Southwark on that huge stage of the Globe, holding, thousands of people, and using massive voices to speak to them. That you go into the Blackfriars Theatre and you're in the Wigmore Hall, and it just totally changes what you could do. And Shakespeare and his collaborators, shall we say, were incredibly acutely aware of, oh my God, if the audience is this close and you can't hear a sound outside, actually you can do plays at night and you can use lights for them and so on. Let's, plunge into this. And it was an extraordinary period of invention and discovery and all of this. Now, that's what I call authentic theatre. If you can think yourself into that, rather than what's happened so much in the last 30 years or 40 years, is where they use the plays. They just use the plays to tell a story about now, or the number of productions of, dear God, with featuring either Stalinist or Nazi kind of police state surveillance, all of that. I mean, it doesn't illuminate Hamlet to do that at all, not at all. It is true that Hamlet is, Denmark's a prison and all of that. We understand that's very clear, but to say he is actually in the gulag is, forget it. It's not good. It doesn't help us at all.
But don't you find it's actually hard to argue against these kind of productions, even with people that are making them, because they say, well, I'm just helping the audience understand it and bringing it into their current setting. And so I agree with you, but more that there's a much deeper kind of authenticity and this kind of placative way of drawing the blacks and the whites, so the audience is confronted with it in a very blatant way, is primitive, but it's very hard to argue against it, don't you find? Because they say, well, you're being so you're not being a sport, and I'm just trying to show what would Hamlet be with if he was on Facebook.
Quite, and there also is a very strong feeling at the moment that theatre must be an engine for social change. But that is absolutely not a given. It can be if you want it to be, and of course many plays have been written with that purpose in mind. But to take a play that wasn't written with that purpose in mind is to deeply reduce the complexities, the fascination, and as Milan Kundera so wonderfully says about the novel, he says the novel exists to say, life isn't as simple as you think it is. And that's what plays are about as well. They say, look, we have all these experiences, these lives we've lived and so on, and it may look as if it's just, cut and dried, black and white, but it's not. People are complex, infinitely complex. And good and bad, one of the reasons many of us love Shakespeare is because of the extraordinary lack of moralism in the plays. There's so little judging in Shakespeare's plays. I mean, of course, Othello is condemned at the end of the play, naturally, we understand, but you absolutely sense that Shakespeare is profoundly compassionate. That compassion, for me, would be the single most outstanding characteristic, apart from his huge poetic genius. But if I'm talking about what the author feels about his characters, compassion, extraordinary compassion.
Yeah, and such a broad range of it. And I wanted to ask you about that. You mentioned social change, and this is perhaps a somewhat controversial question, but so be it. I think you are observing, as all of us are, there's at least a trend to now say, well, how can you be translating the poetry of an African-American woman if you haven't had the Black experience, or if you're not female, or any variation you can come up with, including, who should be playing Othello, who should be singing in Porgy and Bess, and which racial background should that come from. On the other hand, you, especially as an actor, you have been so many people, you have thought the thoughts of so many characters. So I would imagine that you have some strong feelings about this very literal tendency, which I understand supports a very valid cause and concern, but as usual, the devil is in the implementation. So I wanted to know what your feelings are about this literalism that's very prevalent.
Yeah. Well, the literalism is it's so double-sided. This is the problem. This literalism that only, as you say, an African-American writer can translate, or only an African writer can translate an African poet into English. It absolutely cuts against what has been so wonderful about, one of the extraordinary things about the theatre, film, whatever, has been the ability for us to think into the minds of other people, to, as I've been saying all along about thinking the thoughts of another person, but you think, so what could it be like to be a Black general, you as a white person says. And the concomitant of that is it must be right that a Black actor can say, what would it be like to be an English king, King Lear? What is it like? How can I think myself into it? That's a way that we open our capacity for understanding the rest of mankind. I personally have been a passionate proponent of increasing the diversity of actors in the profession. Years ago in Los Angeles, I had a fantastically enjoyable time with a group of actors who were from every possible ethnicity, doing a play by Milan Kundera, in which they were playing 18th century French people. And it was joyous. It was absolutely fantastic. They wore the costumes of the period and absolutely expanded into them and transformed. It was thrilling. Now people are saying madly, oh, you can't ask a Black actor to wear a white person's clothes if you're doing a 17th century play. Well, you say, oh yeah, because that's how you understand the way people were, by how they dressed. That's part of the process of the enlightening process, is just thinking, oh gosh, if you wear a bustier like this, you hold yourself completely differently. You can't say, oh no, I would only wear clothes that I'm comfortable with, this terrible word which has crept into our lives. Comfortable. I'm not comfortable with this. Who the fuck is comfortable? I don't know. I have never been comfortable in my life.
Yes.
But then I did a production at the Old Vic Theatre, which ran for 2 years, of Carmen Jones, which is Oscar Hammerstein's version of Carmen. And it's a brilliant piece of work by Oscar Hammerstein. It's astonishing, actually, quite brilliantly imaginative and highly theatrical. And of course, the dialogue written by Oscar Hammerstein, and a white man, is patois. It's the patois of black people of the 1930s, which was when he wrote it. And the actors the wonderful actors, singers whom I'd employed, it's an entirely black cast, said at one point, this is inauthentic. Fortunately, my conductor was a conductor called Henry Lewis, who was a black conductor, who had been married to Marilyn Horne and all the rest of it. He's now dead. But Henry just said, what are you talking about? I know, I was brought up in that world. This is exactly the way we spoke. This is precisely the way. You think about it. You just actually find out how it was that people spoke in those days. Don't just say a white man wrote it. You can't possibly do it. And I think the whole world is going to shrink as a result of this. But let us, clearly this is a racist world, and it is incumbent on all of us to work against that. But it's not right to adopt, as you said, these very simplistic formulas, which are supposed to make it all right.
Yes, and then there's the difficult thing to argue against also, I find, when you say, yes, well, yes, it's simplistic, and your conversation partner will say, yes, indeed, but it's still better than nothing, which is, of course, true, but we aspire for something not to be just better than nothing, but to actually hit the marks in more profound ways. There was a...
hope that it's a transitional thing. I think it is, and I think it will end up with a better dispensation, but you're right, it's not so great.
There's wonderful questions coming in. I'll pass on some of them now and some of them later. Peter Raj Singh asks, are there overlaps between characters for you? For example, bits of Hamlet when you play Lear, or to experience each as a sui generis? And I wanted to actually even extend that question through your rich life of others with the different characters. Do you then find this crosstalk and in some way maybe positive and negative interference in your life as Simon Callow, that all of a sudden there's some kind of strand of Hamlet and a strand of Lear, or that that moment? Do you get this kind of displacement syndrome in even kind of on a second to second basis?
I don't know about that. I think we all are Hamlet. I think we all have Hamlet in us somewhere, somehow. And I mean women as well. Lear is another matter altogether. There are very few characters that I've played that I've thought, that's me. What was it? There was one I just sort of the other part I never ever played, which is Henry Higgins in Pygmalion or My Fair Lady, and I really stupid thing to say, but I think I could have done that wonderfully. Nobody ever asked me to do that. And Bottom in A Midsummer Night's Dream, who wants to play all the parts. I could relate very strongly to that too, but nobody ever asked me to play Bottom. It's
well, we can extract this video, and then hopefully you will be asked to be Higgins. But you don't get this sort of moments of displacement as you walk on the street, and all of a sudden you wonder who you are.
No, I don't. But I do. I know people do. Some people do. And sometimes it can tip over quite dangerously.
At least we don't have that danger. One doesn't walk and think, "Oh, I'm the appassionata." I mean, if you do, then this is the whole next level of disorder. There was also a question from Emishe Tut, if I pronounce it correctly. If I don't, I apologize. The question being, is it possible to read / understand the monologue of Richard II from the view of Renaissance Baroque tempus philosophy, where number, time, and proportion are kind of mirror of the macrocosmos, the created world in the proportion of the harmony? So if the protagonist says, "I wasted time and now doth time waste me," it has another meaning from the view of the 16th, 17th century, ? Thank you for your marvelous thoughts, so inspiring for understanding of John Dowland's world as well. So what do you make of that question? And
I agree. I think he's absolutely right. And there's a very similar concept in The Merchant of Venice, where Lorenzo talks about the proportion in the heavens and how the harmony of the stars and all the rest of it. That's absolutely, yes, Renaissance thinking, cultural, aesthetic thinking, you know?
And we talked about this at the very beginning. Well, those that logged in right from the start saw your wonderful reading of the sonnet. And if you want, we can even repeat that, or we don't have to. I have the words here, which I can paste into the chat. And as I said to you, it would be wonderful to have you go a bit, line by line, word by word. In fact, I would enjoy that. But to have you look with us at the sonnet and how you understand it, and how your understanding then finally influences your reading of it. In our introductory conversation some days ago, you also talked about the famous "to be or not to be" line, and how even that has certain proportions in which you find it still works. Right. And then no longer works. And I think that would be very interesting to catch a glimpse of, if one can.
It's a real balance, and I'm absolutely sure you have exactly the same challenge, which is you want to release as much of the meaning as you possibly can, destroying the meter. And so what we talked about Hamlet was it's the most famous line Shakespeare wrote, and possibly the most famous line of dramatic poetry ever written, which is "to be or not to be. That is the question, whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles and by opposing end them." So the question that you ask is, first of all, what sort of a state is Hamlet in when he says this? Now, it's quite a reasonable speech. Many actors play it tremendously overwrought. Sometimes you don't really understand what they're saying at all. But the very first line, it's so simple that you almost think it's amazing that nobody else had ever written it before, which is for a man who is dissatisfied, profoundly dissatisfied with his life, with a profound sense that something is wrong. Something is wrong in his family. There's something seriously wrong, to the extent that he thinks it would, and it confuses him. It torments him like hornets in your brain. So his thoughts turn, as many people do in that kind of situation, to suicide. But because he's a prince who's been studying at Wittenberg, and he's really a rational figure, he steps back from it and tries to analyze it, and to what is this thing about, do you live or do you die? I mean, if life is intolerable, well, but the very first line is "to be or not to be. That is the question, whether it is nobler in the mind." But that phrase, it should certainly, especially for an Elizabethan, for whom the afterlife was a daunting prospect, a terrifying prospect. But you've got to somehow, this is where the old actors were just fantastic, to just suddenly produce a chill in the house, in the audience, because he's saying, you can live or you can die. Which is better? Life or death? And now we all want to live. Well, we believe anyway, we want to live. That is our inherent human instinct. But how can we convey to the audience that he's actually contemplating this really huge thing in these few simple words? To be or not to be. And for any of us, for me, I mean, the thought of my not being is a tremendously hard concept to take on board. How could I not be? I've always been, you know. I mean, of course, I know I will die, but to be or not to be. Now, can you interfere with the meter as much as that? Because that rhythm of thought that Hamlet has is perfectly contained within those iambic pentameters, to be or not to be. You somehow, as an actor, you've got to be able to enter into that thought as surely as a violinist hits the strings instantly at the right place. To say, and that's technical, but it also has to be absolutely felt. So unless I say to be or not to be, or not to be, I mean, there are so many ways that you can inflect it, slightly this way, slightly that way. But whatever happens, the audience is suddenly going to think, wow, God, this guy is like, you know, if you saw somebody on the street standing on a bridge, for example, and you thought, fuck, he's going to die. He's going to throw himself off. And in the, you know, famously in the old days of the Irish touring theatre, the peasants of West Ireland who had not seen plays like this would shout out and say, you know, don't kill yourself. You know, I mean, literally like in a pantomime. But I mean, in a way, that's a fantastic thing that they would have that. I've just seen something very sinister, which is that my battery is about to expire. So just wait 2 seconds and back.
We have the text even in the chat. So if we speak for a bit about the sonnet that you said is actually one that you would have picked as a possible one to speak about text interpretation. Yeah.
And also to bring us round to our starting point, it's about time. Sonnets, and nobody absolutely knows who they were written for or to or why exactly, but the collection of 6 or 7 of them is not uniformly inspired, but at least 2/3 of it is among the greatest poetry ever written in the English language. It's such a huge outpouring. And the form is very strict. It's always the same. It's 14 lines, and the rhyme scheme is always A, B, C, D, C, D, E, E. No, there's more, but E, the couplet is always rhymed. It's definitely a formal writing. We just, you know, obviously in the plays, there are occasionally rhymed speech, but it's quite rare. It's mostly unrhymed. So there's a little thing, first of all. The rhyme is there for a reason. It's there, you know, it has to be part of the pleasure of the piece, of hearing it and seeing it. That's number one. Number two, sonnets. These sonnets are really extraordinary. First of all, they're so personal, so intensely felt. Over the course of the sonnets, and there have been many attempts to reorder the sonnets. I performed them all once at the National Theatre in London in 1979. I was 30, and I did all of the sonnets on one afternoon, 3.5 hours, and in a new order, which proposed identifying particular characters and so on and so forth. What is very clear in the poems is that Shakespeare writes a whole series of poems to a young man, urging him to get married. Then something in the relationship with the young man seems to have changed. It becomes more sort of informal and slightly more intimate. And then he starts to talk, the poet, starts to talk about his passionate love for this young man. I personally wouldn't absolutely say it was a sexual passion, but it's certainly amour fou. He's absolutely in love with this young man, who seems to be everything he isn't. The young man is beautiful, the young man is aristocratic, the young man is highly educated. None of these things were true of Shakespeare. And then there's the question of the dark lady, so-called dark lady, a set of poems written to clearly the poet's mistress, who is passionate, difficult, sexually rampant, and so on. Then it seems that the young man to whom the poems are addressed has an affair with the woman, the dark lady, so-called. And it all falls out very badly, except that Shakespeare doesn't seem to forgive the woman, but he does forgive the young man. And then the rest of the poems, as they go on, are warm and intimate towards the addressee. But ultimately, they become less about their relationship and more about time itself. Time is the dominant figure in the sonnets right from the beginning, from the very early ones, where he has that wonderful line. This is just the first line, but it's a wonderful onomatopoeic line where he says, "When I do count the clock that tells the time." He creates the ticking of a clock in the actual verse. It's astonishing, resourceful poetry. Anyway, each of these poems is like a drama of its own. You could make a film of any one sonnet. There are so many images. The images evolve throughout it. They almost always, not always, but very often resolve themselves in terms of the bond between the two of them, in the case of the poems written to the young man. But for the actor, and these poems are used very much in the English theatre as training tools for actors, because you need to make the imagery utterly vivid. We need to see these things. But again, as with what we've been discussing, it's not, you don't want to wrench the verse around, you don't want to force these images on people. You have to somehow create a sense of spontaneity about the evolution of the images. But you have to really, I've only recently felt that it's my job when I'm speaking these poems to try to get a sense of them being composed freely, in the same way that you know, we're also very aware of the fact that Beethoven was a great improviser, and that there is that inherent in his music. And we feel that Shakespeare too has this great capacity to make things, you know, to make things up very felicitously and quickly. Anyway, this particular poem has some of the most wonderful images. It starts with like as the waves make towards the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end. Now, first of all, this is a completely technical thing, but if you were just reading it as a meditative poem, you would say, like as the waves make towards the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end. But I'm suggesting that you want to awaken the ear of the person who's hearing the sonnet to the next line and the possibility of the next line. So as you always lead on. So like as the waves make towards the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end, each changing place with that which goes before. In sequent toil, all forwards to contend. So you've got this massive seascape that he creates as an image of our life, of these waves going one after another, succeeding each other, the different ages of man. A thing, of course, which he was also absolutely hypnotized by, this idea of the ages of man. So it's like as the waves make towards the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end, each changing place with that which goes before, in sequent toil, all forwards to contend. So there's no going back, it's always forward, all forwards to contend. Nativity, once in the main of light, crawls to maturity, wherewith being crowned, crooked eclipses against his glory fight. And time, which gave, doth now his gift confound. And this is increasingly the case in the sonnets. Time, the enemy. And it's like he's lurking at every corner as you go down the street. There's time. It's not, well, time with his sickle, of course. And that's, so in a way, time is the villain of this piece. So you've got to identify time pretty clearly. In sequent to all forwards to contend. This wonderful image of nativity. He takes an abstract noun to describe the birth of a child. Nativity, once in the main of light, so as soon as the child is born, nativity, once in the main of light, crawls to maturity. And it's sort of almost like, that the baby in Popeye. This little baby is crawling along and then suddenly, maturity, wherewith being crowned with maturity, crooked eclipses against his glory fight, and time, which gave, doth now his gift confound. And then that's the first section of the poem. Then time doth transfix the flourish set on youth. Transfixes it, kind of, it's almost like an arrow going into it. The brow of youth is suddenly battered by time. Delves the parallels in beauty's brow. No, it's just an amazing phrase. Ploughing a field. The lines that we get on our brow are, time's doing. Time delves the parallels in beauty's brow. Feeds on the rarities of nature's truth. The youngest and most beautiful are taken away by time. And nothing stands but for his scythe to mow. And then, whether we think he absolutely believes this or whether he just wants to believe it, he says, and yet in times to hope my verse shall stand, despite him and his something hand. And it's there's so much in it. It's 14 lines. It's just astonishingly full of these images. Nativity, crawls to maturity. The audience has got, I think these sonnets are spoken, as I said, as if they were kind of yes, meditations or philosophical pieces, but they're urgent. It's a tragedy which has befallen the human race, that this monster, time, passes among us, just cutting us down. You have the same thing in many, 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 many of the sonnets. You've got the same thing in "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometimes too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed." And I've forgotten the line. But anyway, it takes you through until he says, "Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest." Just as he says in the Waves poem, my verse shall stand. There's this desperate hope and belief that time can be conquered by art. And of course, it's true. It happened, you know. He wrote these lines, whatever, 430 years ago, and we're reading them still. So his verse has stood. It's an extraordinary boast to make, but it's absolutely true.
In those rare and incredible occasions, then that it does stand.
Yeah.
Our friend Jared McBurney commented earlier when quoting you, "These poems are used very much as training tools," and he just wrote Bach. So
Yeah.
and of course, and his verse has stood as well. Some questions relating to this amazing demonstration. Donato Cabrera, a conductor, colleague, and friend, asked Mr. Callow, if you were to perform the sonnets today, would you still perform them in the order that you did when you were in your 30s? And speaking of time, how has your understanding of these sonnets evolved since that marathon performance?
Well, the truth is I do perform them, and I have a program which is about a third of them all. I do about 50, maybe a little bit more, and I get great nourishment from it. And I do take as a starting point that same order of the psychiatrist John Pardell, whose daughter Ruth Pardell is a very famous poet, and John's dead now. But my understanding, I don't think my understanding of the emotional situation of the poems has changed at all. I think I've absolutely, I knew it the way you sometimes do when you're young. I just sort of knew it. I got it in one. I absolutely understood this, and this self-loathing that the poet had. I'm no stranger to that myself. This sense of worthlessness, it's extraordinary. It's amazing how I have no time at all to spend, but watch the world without end hour, whilst you, my Lord, make happy those where you are. I said it's amour fou, but it's amour kind of self-flagellating, but genius, absolute genius. However, I think technically my understanding of the poems is hugely advanced and changed, which of course means probably that the meaning of them has changed as well. I think I've, you know, I certainly understood when I was 30 that time is the enemy, but I didn't know it the way I do now when I'm 71, when it's, you know, my best friend. Time, you know, and I are marching side by side.
And when you say technical understanding, what to apply for you?
Well, it's really to do with, I think I was much more interested in the rhetoric of the poems. It was the sort of big statement that they made. Whereas what I'm utterly obsessed by now is the development of the imagery and the way that you see it all happen. As a listener, you follow this extraordinary journey of these waves, and then this baby emerging into manhood and then being crushed by crooked eclipses. You know, that's what they're every one of these is an epic canvas, and they're just incomparable. There's nothing in the English language to remotely compare with these sonnets. I think they're utterly, utterly extraordinary. In this, some of them are a little obscure, but that's probably because we don't know what was going on, what the background is. Occasionally they're a little verbally obscure, but not much. Mostly they're just very, very human, absolutely human. And that's what I'm interested in, that. In humanity, the humanity of each of us as individuals fascinates me. I mean, and inspires me in a way. But it's very easy for us to let go of that humanity, you know.
Is that also what interested you in Faust, the humanity?
Faust?
Yes, because you did the big two-part production.
I did. No, what fascinated me about Faust was just the amplitude of Goethe's brain. I didn't know much of Goethe's work before then. Then I read everything. I read the novels and the poems and the wonderful Roman elegies and all of that. And this man, who was, I don't think, a very sympathetic human being at all, but he was capacious, you could, to put it mildly. He absorbed so much. And in that sense, he's not un-Shakespearean. And also, of course, I don't read German, so I can't really know how great a poet he is in German. But even the little ones that I do know, you know, the poems from, Mignon, whatever that novel is called, the Wilhelm Meister, they seem to be just perfect. Even I understand what they mean, but even not being a German speaker, I can sense the perfection of them. They're exquisite. To tell you the truth, I did the whole thing on the radio first. I did Faust on the radio. They did all 7 hours of it on the radio. And I played Faust, and a lovely actor who now just dead called Ronald Pickup played Mephistopheles. And I thought, this is a mug's game playing Faust. The part to play is Mephistopheles. So I went to a theatre director of my acquaintance and I said, why don't we do the Faust? And he said, fabulous, I love it and I've always wanted to do it. And I said, and I'll play Mephistopheles this time. And he said, yeah, quite right, it'd be fantastic. So we started auditioning actors to play Faust. And we simply couldn't find anybody. It's a very difficult part, really. I mean, you start at 140 and then you suddenly become 30, and then you slowly age up over the rest of the play till you're 200. And mostly he's in a perpetual soliloquy, in searching of dissatisfaction, unhappiness, and all of this. But anyway, I said, well, he said, well, if we can't get it Faust, we can't do it. So I said, oh, fuck it. I've done it already on the radio. I'll do it. So I did it. And then, of course, in doing it, I came to love it. I just came to love this unending capacity for introspection of Faust himself. And it's not for nothing that he haunted the European imagination for some years, although, of course, it's an English story, basically. Dr. Faustus, and it was the English puppeteers doing Faust in Germany that brought the story to Goethe's attention. Well, there's a chapbook, which is what actually Goethe came across. But it is the attempt, Faust is the attempt to put the world on the stage. The world, the whole of human history, the whole of human intellect, the whole of the human heart, everything. And it is worth pointing out that on his deathbed, Goethe said, never try to stage Faust. Never do it. And then he died. It's very difficult. We did some parts of it absolutely wonderfully and some parts of it not so well. But the audiences absolutely loved it, because here's the 7 hours. We did it, first of all, we did it part 1 on Monday, part 2 on Tuesday, part 1 and 2 on Wednesday, part 1 on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, like that. But it turned out that people only really wanted to see all of it. They wanted to go on this great journey, the journey of Faust and of humankind, I suppose. It's like an everyman story in a kind of a sense. And it was wonderful. People loved it, and it was very moving, very stirring, that people just sat and watched this story. We had a wonderful translation. It was just a wonderful, wonderful translation. And the director, David Freeman, is a very, very distinguished opera director, had some wonderful interpretations, and it was fascinating. But I think anybody who does all of Faust, even Peter Stein, when he did it, has to admit, well, I've just about scratched the surface of it. It's huge. It's just vast.
Amazing. Simon Anand has a question. Given that Samuel Beckett's work is so precisely choreographed, what was the kind of pleasure you found when playing Pozzo in Waiting for Godot? And also, please, could you explain the style of makeup you chose, which was so contrapunctual to the text?
Well, Simon, good evening. He's a wonderful photographer, Simon. The thing about that play is, Waiting for Godot, it's Beckett's first play. And I don't think he had any idea what he was asking people to do, because all those repetitions and the incredibly carefully, as you say, choreographed stage directions really mean that for a long part of the rehearsal period, you're just trying to learn it. And you're trying to work out this kind of physical business, which is almost impossible, but has to, where the rope that Pozzo's got lucky on, when he has to let it out, when he has to bring it back, and so on. But I do remember this. When we did it, when we did the reading, I did this production of it with Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart and Ronald Pickup, who I mentioned played Mephistopheles on the radio with me. I said after the read-through, I mean, I really wasn't, this was just totally true. I said, I have no idea how I can ever play this character. I mean, Pozzo, the tramps are, in a sense, recognizable figures, but Pozzo is, you know, he makes his first entrance with a strange, silent slave on the end of a rope. What do we think about that? What does, now, of course, we think immediately of imperialism, and we immediately think this is an image of Pozzo is his slave, an image of the oppression of empires. But there's nothing, you can't be that simple-minded about Waiting for Godot. The extraordinary thing about Waiting for Godot is that I can't remember quite how old he was. He wasn't young, but he was probably in his mid-30s or something. And Beckett, writes stuff in that play, which is the equal of King Lear, especially, funnily enough, in the role of Pozzo, especially when Pozzo's blind and comes back, makes his famous speech about they give birth astride of a grave. It's unbelievably brilliant. But I never had a worse time working on that part. I mean, it was so hard. But when we did it, it became easy. That's the strange thing about it. And what was particularly wonderful is because it was Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart, what I call the Jean-Luc Gandalf kind of axis, audiences, especially when we were on tour, who had never heard of Samuel Beckett, came to see the play. And it turned out that a lot of them thought they were seeing a play called Waiting for God, which is a television comedy series in England about vicars. But because they had no preconception what the play was like, they just loved it. They roared with laughter. They didn't think they were seeing one of the great philosophical statements of the 20th century. They just thought they're seeing their old mates Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart and these very funny tramps, and it was wonderful. I mean, it was an extraordinary experience.
Simon asked, what was the pleasure of performing it then?
Well, that was the pleasure. That was the pleasure of performing it, really, was allowing it to pass through you. Because it's like a Greek drama in that sense. You have to let the god enter into you. And even though they're not gods or classic heroes, it's that same thing. There's something so objective about it. And it just has to, and here's, psychology is of no use to you, whatever. The thing that saved my bacon completely when I was lost with this part, I was completely lost with it. I had no real idea what I was doing. I was saying the words, I was making the moves and so on. I started to read Joseph Conrad's great novel, Heart of Darkness. And I started to, there's a character in it, a weird character who is a small part, but he just riveted me in the Congo, where he's wearing sort of motley clothes and so on. And I had this idea that Pozzo has the feeling of a ringmaster, and that he should have that, the hat and the little jacket and the jodhpurs, you know, the riding shoes and riding shoes and trousers, and all that was good, that was fine, but I was nowhere near it. I was nowhere near it. I was away a million miles from it. So then I did what I very often do in these circumstances. I reached for music, and I got the idea that Shostakovich would help me, and it was the 8th symphony. That extraordinary scherzo, which goes, it goes, there's a scream on the clarinet. And I thought, yes, this is their journey across the terrain, which presumably Pozzo owns, and you see them from far off, and I just got that music into my bones. And that absolutely solved it for me. Just as when I did, when I created the part of Mozart in Amadeus at the National Theatre, I gave a performance of it at the read-through, which was very extreme indeed, because that's the way Peter Schaffer had written it. Absolutely, you know, the shrieking, angry, coarse little man. And Peter Hall was the director, and Peter put his arm around my shoulder at the end of the read-through, and he said, that was a very brave performance, which normally you think, they're going to sack me. And he said, no, but it's all there. It all has to be there like that. But I have to believe at every moment you're on stage that you wrote the overture to The Marriage of Figaro. And that was it for me. That was it. Because then I had my inner life. And so I learned the overture to The Marriage of Figaro. And the whole performance was just all of that. It was just all that bustle and then it just gave me something. And music does that for me so often. I depend on it completely.
Yes, and you write so eloquently about music, and I think we have to. I hope I'll be able to convince you to come and talk to all of us again soon, because I think we could stay much longer in Shakespeare and then all the roles that you played. But then I would love to ask you more about direction of opera or theater, and of course about Wagner and your great reservoir of knowledge on Orson Welles is also something that one wants to hear you speak about, and so I hope you will agree to come and speak more. But perhaps before I let you go, and to have you soothe your foot, and again, I'm very grateful that you power through this after having had a surgery. But recently, when our friends Jared and Simon McBurney were here, and we had spoken about the importance of art in this time. So circling back to time and timelessness and suspension of time and suspension of being able to practice art the way the way I know, especially the so-called performing arts. I think there's, as well as I do, or better, a great debate and I think search for how to defend the arts. And you already made some points that you think the theater should be part of the NHS, which is very catchy. But when the arts are shown their place now in political and public life, and often it seems to be a place that's of lesser importance than we would think it ought to be. How do you, what's the defense against saying is that, well, that's a very nice extra thing in our life, but look, there are the priorities and life goes on. We could still go to Mallorca on a packed airplane, but no, you can't go to the theater. And perhaps do we even need to support the theaters? Because, well, where's the benefit in that?
Well, it's an extremely hard case to make, as it would
That's
be.
why I ask you.
Yes, because you're dealing with things like the meaning of culture, the degree to which the culture of a nation belongs to everybody. And of course, that's very difficult because almost nothing culturally belongs to everybody. I mean, there are many music lovers who detest opera and won't go anywhere near it. There are many people who love the theatre but loathe Shakespeare. It's very, very hard. We're dealing with, as many different people as there are in the United Kingdom or in Germany, each one with a different view about it. All I can say, and I hate to make the economic argument because it's demeaning, but a lot of people seem to like it, is all I can say, and are prepared to pay money to see it. And I cannot but believe that they aren't, to some extent, irradiated by it. But of course, then again, there are lots of things I don't like to see in the theatre, or indeed in the concert hall, and so I could, of course, repeat what we all say, that Churchill's famous remark about this is why we're at war, because of the culture that we're going to maintain and so on. I mean, it is a difficult one. I can't give you a simple or really a very convincing reply. I have benefited so much in my life from art of every kind. I've been lucky enough. My grandmother was a singer, and so I grew up with a lot of records of classical music and singers and so on. And I've always had an impulse towards music, towards painting, towards sculpture, towards writing, towards all of these things. Fully for me, you may say. My mother had no such interest at all. My mother believed that Shakespeare was a confidence trick practiced on the general population, that he was incomprehensible and no good at all. Stupid stories. And, you know, I didn't really have an argument for her either. I couldn't say, well, it's awfully good, when she was telling me, no, it's not. It's so personal, this, that I'm afraid I'm speechless, really, on that.
Well, I'm with you. I think the great argument is that it is, in the best sense, amusing and entertaining. In a profound sense, amusing,
Yeah.
profound sense, entertaining, and that should be defense enough. So I think the argument is often posed in the sort of we're immediately off foot, because that's not the argument. What good is it? It is what the receiver makes of it.
Yes, and I think that we live in a slightly unhappy time with regard to all of this, because when I was first going to opera and so on, there was an opera company called Sadler's Wells, which was devoted entirely to opera in English, which, you know, is a commonplace in Germany to do that, but it was unusual in England, and it was an extraordinary company, and they explored everything, modern music and basic repertory and all of that. And they were a wonderful company, and that company grew out of the Old Vic Theatre in London, and the whole movement called Art for Everybody. Sometimes they said every man, but sometimes they said everybody. There are a whole lot of books I have on my shelves, some by a man called Edward J. Dent, which are just passionate about getting art to the places where art is not to be found, and involving people in it and so on. And it really worked fantastically. And at the end of the war, because of the extraordinary work that had been done by the theatre and by pianists like Myra Hesse playing at the National Gallery and all of that, the Arts Council, this thing called the Arts Council, was invented and started to do that more and more. And then somewhere in the baleful 1980s, a double thing started to happen. One was that Margaret Thatcher basically destroyed the councils of England, the individual local councils. And so they had no money to spend on the theatres that they were sustaining and the concert halls and all of that. And then came this idea now that the arts are essentially elitist, and they're about subjects that nobody who's an ordinary person could possibly want to know about, and that there's no joy in it. Well, in these glory days that I'm talking about, there were various benefactors who gave large sums of money so that people could go to the opera house, the Royal Opera House, for £1. And I'll bet you everyone who went to that is an opera lover today. And so the seed is sown, but it'll just sound elitist of me to say, I think it would make everyone's life a lot better if they had this. And one of the other things that we have to fight for so hard nowadays is the idea of reading, the pleasure of reading. But in fact, it's growing, interestingly enough. During the lockdown, people started to read much more because they needed to do something which was just for them. Their relationship with a book was the crucial thing. And it's empowering in that sense alone. It's you and your book. You have a dialogue with your book. That's so beneficial. But anyway, it's no good us standing on our boxes and saying all these things, because I'm afraid the mood of the moment is against us.
Well, but one ought not to succumb to it, at least not entirely. And apparently piano sales are up during the lockdown also, which is fascinating.
Is that right? Yes. I believe.
Apparently piano shops, I've read in the States and in the UK, I think, have had a better year than most. So it's not all dark and gloom, but I hope that you will come back and let us speak more about all these other topics that we didn't even start to touch in your very, as you said, capacious world and mental landscape. So I hope I can convince you soon.
Yes, I'm sure you can.
I wanted to thank you, and I want to thank our participants for the questions and for listening. And just very briefly, that's it for this month. But next month, Reinhard Goebel will come back and continue his exploration of the Brandenburg concertos. The historical background alone took about almost 3 hours. And then we've decided that the music examples ought to come the next time. So there's precedent for continuing and spilling into the next seminar. And here are the relevant links. And I want to wish everybody health and happy Easter, Passover, whatever one celebrates, or just some peaceful days. And to you, happy healing, and I hope more very soon. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Good night, everyone.